The Mission, Chapter 2. A soft breeze was rustling through the deep wilderness around a little mission called Shimikin, which was situated in the beautiful Spokane Valley in the far west, not many miles from where Gray Cloud and his friends lived. The people around here were not so warlike as they had been in the days gone by. The Indians did not seem to want war. They felt they had been through enough of that, and the few white people who ventured near them acted as though they felt the same way. Occasionally a man who called himself a priest called on some of them, and although his actions were a mystery to them, they did not trouble him, and he did nothing to harm them, except to stir up their curiosity as to who he was. He did not seem to fear them as most white people did. He never carried a gun or even a bow and arrow with which to protect himself. But more white people were appearing, people who, like the priest, seemed to have no fear of them and wanted nothing but to be allowed to live in peace. Such were Elkanah and Mary Walker, who occupied the mission house. Nearby stood another cabin, the home of missionary Reverend Cushing Eels. It was the first mission some of them had ever seen, and they were naturally curious about it. Some of the trees had been cut away and a small clearing had been made, in the center of which a log cabin had been built. Around the cabin, other improvements had been made, and a short distance from there stood the mission itself. A few yards away could be heard the rippling waters of the Shimikin Creek as it wended its way merrily to join the Spokane River a few miles distant. Shimikin was the first mission in the Spokane Valley, founded by Elkanah Walker and Cushing Eels in 1838. From the direction of the creek, from whose shadow depths many a squirming spot trout had emerged unwillingly, there came the sound of millions of frogs, which occasionally the hoot of an owl came from somewhere among the deep and heavy bushes that lined both sides of the creek. It was quiet and peaceful here in the valley, with green sloping hills on each side, as if to protect these brave pioneers against the many dangers of new country. The surrounding woods were full of wild game, which helped to keep up the food supply. Also, at the right season, an abundance of delicious berries grew, strawberries, huckleberries, and others too numerous to mention. Their living expense problems would have been even more simple if only the man could have found time and inclination to hunt more, and the women could have had more time to search out and gather the right berries as they grew in their many hiding places. But missionaries, wherever situated, found many worries attached to the work they had come so far to do, and one of these was the fact that the Indians found it so hard to understand them and their intentions. To make the Indians realize that they were there to help and not to harm them was almost next to impossible, and for this the missionaries knew the Indians were not to blame. The Indians could see that these white people were different, that they never tried to cheat them nor to steal from them, and that they were always willing to help them when they needed help. For this reason, the Indians tried to be good to them, for they often needed help. Quite often they would bring their white friends meat or berries, and sometimes they would bring them dried meat or other dried food, such as salmon and camas, which the missionaries were always grateful to receive. So in time, many of the Indians of this tribe came to realize that the white people were somewhat like themselves, in that some were good and some were bad. But the bad ones were so very bad that their badness so far overshadowed the good in the others that the Indians found it hard to understand just what the good ones were good for. Who were they then, and what was it all coming to? They finally realized that the white missionaries were trying to teach them something, but what? They taught that their God was a spirit, but they believed in a spirit God too. So this had to be explained to them, and until the white people could learn to speak to them in their own language, or some of them could learn to speak English, it was impossible to see where they could make any headway. But the missionaries saw these obstacles, and it did not take them long to decide on a way to overcome them. By much patience, determination, and hard work, they finally mastered enough of the Indian language to give them the respect these friendly Indians and the ability to speak as man to man with them, and thereby enjoy real fellowship with them, which was the only way to reach the heart of the Indians and to promote a better understanding. At first, the Indians were quite curious about the white missionaries, which made it very hard for the women ventured so far west. In spite of the friendly overtures of the Indian neighbors, at times it became almost intolerable to find that they were so persistently being watched night and day, whether outside or inside their home, by men, women, and children whenever an opportunity was offered. They dared not open the door unless from sheer necessity, for if there were any Indians around, they would be sure to crowd into the little cabin, and out would go what little privacy they had been able to enjoy. For if a white woman was lucky enough to have windows in her cabin, it was never private, for the windows would usually be full of dark faces. The way the white people dressed, lived and worked, cooked and ate was all fascinating to the Indians, that the temptation to watch was overwhelming, and if the white people showed too much resentment, they would probably have laid it to the fact that they were up to some mischief and could bear a little more watching. Thus, along with learning the language of the Indians, missionaries found that they needed to study their nature also, and while the Indians were teaching them their language, they must learn the English language along with the ways of a God-fearing, law-abiding citizen of America, and not to be imitators of those who have no respect for the laws of God and man, and to whom Christianity meant very little. So in this way, a better understanding sprang up between them, although it was far from being perfect. But some of the Indians were loyal to them in all their troubles and did all they could to help them, while some could not get over being suspicious. These were always on the watch for some form of treachery, which made it extremely difficult to work with them, especially in times of sickness, for at such times they would usually get their own medicine men, and it was always dangerous for any white man to interfere. If the Indian should die while in the hands of a white man, it was often impossible for him to explain it out of the consequences, which were often very severe, even costing the life of the white man and perhaps many others, even though the patient would probably have died much sooner had he been under the care of the superstitious medicine man. Helping the Indians to learn about civilization was very much like playing with dynamite, and often very discouraging, to say the least. No Indian could forget entirely that after all, these white people really represented their enemy. So even though the missionaries made good friends among the Indians, the missionaries knew that only one thing was absolute certain, and that was their promised reward in heaven for the work they were trying to faithfully do. They wanted above all else to save precious souls, but God's gift of love was free. They knew they were paying for it and paying very dearly in blood, homes, and all that life holds most dear. A few years earlier, it would have been much harder for the missionaries, but by this time most of the Indians in the far west had become reconciled to their fate. And while many could not find it in their hearts to forgive, some had begun coming to them for help and enlightenment. The grateful, abused Indians found it hard to keep on hating people who demanded nothing of them in return for all they so willingly gave in material help as well as spiritual. Many of the Indians, some from miles away, came for relief from their mental or bodily suffering and were always made welcome at this little mission and often took great pleasure in returning the kindness. Thus they did in many ways had it ever became necessary to do so. The Indians would not consent to giving the missionaries up when the board advised the missionaries to move to another location where there were more white people and where there would be more protection against danger from the Cayuse Indians who were on a rampage not many miles away. The Spokanes were a peaceful tribe, but when they saw their friends were in danger, they fought to protect them, and did until the fighting Indians were brought under control before their damaging work reached the missionaries. But it was not for long. A short time later, these good people were transferred to what was considered a much safer location near the west coast, to the great source of the Spokane Indian, who missed their kind friends very much. They had accomplished more good amongst these people than they had ever realized. The good that they had done reached from there far into the hearts to come, since the seed of Christianity had been sown in some of the hearts of the Indians who never forgot. They had become faithful workers amongst their own people and proved as time passed on that Christianity, when truly accepted and lived by any race of people, no matter what race or nationality, will thrive and never die. Although it became comparatively peaceful here in the West, and the good works of the priest, who often went from place to place, watching over their widely scattered converts, and bringing into their fold a new one occasionally, and the missionaries who had done so much to scatter the word of God among the Spokane Indians and other places, there was still much fighting and unrest in other parts of the country. The tribe, in an attempt to find a way to obtain their old way of life in all of its aspects of peace and happiness, was roaming from place to place, hoping to find where white people had not intruded. They had lost their freedoms, which was something that they had never been aware of until they no longer possessed it. But although many young Indians men had given their lives for their country's sake, now the time had come when they knew that it was slowly but surely slipping away from them, and that many more lives would be sacrificed before it was over. But regardless of how black the future looked to them, Gray Cloud and his tribe knew that life must go on, and although the white people had changed their ways to a certain extent, the basic piece of their lives would still remain on a level keel, in that they must still hunt and fish for a living, even though this looking for food was often dangerous and sometimes ended in fighting instead of hunting. But eventually they must bring home food for their families, and in spite of all discouragements, they must raise these families. So with war always much too near to them, and the effects of it always much too evident, life went on. With the old folks passing on to their happy hunting grounds, babies were born to replace them. Babies who always seemed to the mothers to be sweeter than the ones before, with their bright eyes and thick shiny hair, their chubby hands and feet. It had been a year since little Lyons had come into this little village where lived Gray Cloud and those whom he loved and ruled with an iron hand. They had moved many times during the past year, for no place was safe for long. And now little Lyons had a baby sister, and they named her Redwing. Falling Leaf was very happy these days and very busy. She was finding out that bringing up a baby was quite a responsibility, since she had brought one safely to her first birthday, which had been duly celebrated by the whole tribe with much feasting and well-wishing. And now little Redwing was here. There was only one way to feed a baby, so if for any reason the mother was unable to feed her baby, there was always some obliging friend to help her out. But judging by the looks of her two babies, Falling Leaf was getting along just fine. As for clothes, soft and clean deer hides took care of that, along with the soft down in the birch basket, for when fresh down was needed, there was always more where that came from. At first, when the baby was small enough to spend most of its time sleeping, the birch basket was perfectly satisfactory. But as it grew older, it naturally became more active, and other methods of caring for it were necessary. The mother, too, had much work to do and less time in which to do it. So the next step in the baby's life was its introduction to the baby board, which was made of bark, or a smooth board, if one could possibly be found, cut rounded at both ends, about 1.5 feet at one end for the top, and the other end was 6 or 8 inches wide. The baby boards varied much in size and style, for some were large and were often extravagantly decorated with fringes made from buckskin, which was also the material used for covering the board. The board, especially the head, which was often very beautifully made, with whatever trimmings the mother found available. Sometimes it was shells, thread made from horse hair, and beautifully tinted in different colors, or of sinew from a deer and colored. Porcupine quills were another favorite type of trimming. These were quite plentiful and were also used on dresses and for other purposes, such as being strung and worn as beads. The large beads were more showy, but were also much more cumbersome and uncomfortable to carry. But the small ones with simple trimming were lighter and easier for the mother to carry on her back, especially while she was busy with her household duties. In making the baby board, a lot of time and patience was required, for it is not as simple as one would think. First, the board is covered with buckskin, the front being cut in 2 pieces and the 2 pieces sewed along the edges to the back piece and extending outward for several inches. Along the edges of these 2 flaps, buttonholes are made, and the flaps are laced together with a buckskin string to form a large pocket. Then the baby is warmly wrapped and placed on the board and snugly laced up, where it inevitably goes right off to sleep with nothing but his little face showing, and if removed from his bed would cry until safely tucked back in his board again, where it could sleep soundly for hours, perfectly contented. A strong rope or wide strip of buckskin was fastened to each side of the board, and the board, baby, and all could be carried on the mother's back. Then while at work, whether at picking berries or in digging roots, the mother often hung the cradle on the limb of a nearby tree where the gentle breeze cooperated by rocking the baby to sleep. As the child grew, the lacings would be lengthened and more room made until it was big enough to discard the board, often much to the disgust of the baby, for it was very hard at first for him to get to sleep without the familiar feel of the baby board to support his little body and to hold him steady. That's the end of chapter 2.